Hello, everyone, and welcome to Channel 4. And this is going to be an exciting kickoff to Channel 4. I'm really excited about this as the topic that we're going to be diving into via a fireside chat is that of responsible AI. It's really a key problem of our time. It is the incredible intersection of technology and society. And I'm really, really excited to introduce two individuals who are going to have a fascinating discussion on this. The first is John Weigelt. He is the National Technology Officer for Microsoft Canada. Welcome, John. And wonderful to have you. And I noted with interest your background in Royal Military College Communication Security and having spent some time with Department of National Defense and CIOB Treasury Board as well. So really, really looking forward to having you lead the conversation. And coming in to join John, we have Vik Pant, who apparently is an avid photographer, loves taking landscape photos, and I imagine in this pandemic has had lots of material. And seems like a great hobby to have these days. And Vik is the Chief Scientist and Chief Science Advisor for Natural Resources Canada. And when I think of Canada, one of the things that I think the world thinks of Canada is natural resources. And with your role, I understand, Vik, that you are heavily involved in making evidence-based science and decision-making, and how do we connect that with policy to support, where we're going in the world. So thank you, Vik, for joining us, and John, and look forward to hearing from you. I just want to explain very briefly before I zip away into the cloud that the audience, please type your questions into the chat line of the Forward 50 platform. Please recall that there is a code of conduct that you agreed to in joining the platform, and please use it wisely. And then after you gentlemen are done, I'll be back and we'll have some questions if we have time.
Perfect, Ian.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for that introduction. And before I jump into the conversation with Vik, I just want to start off and perhaps put a little bit of context behind that video you saw for the digital tech supercluster. It really reflects this importance of digital technology, digital transformation for Canada's prosperity. And artificial intelligence is a white hot topic in that regard. But when we start to think about that prosperity, Deloitte suggests that if we're going to maintain our prosperity through the use of AI, we need to build both understanding and trust in those technologies. And it's kind of paradoxical because Canada has so many leadership roles in AI, and yet we lag the G8 in our trust in these tools. If we look from coast to coast to coast, we see AI in use in Halifax and New Brunswick for fisheries, for transportation, for the forestry region. We can move a little bit more west and we see Montreal and the powerhouse that's there in Mila and the University of Montreal. We move even further, we find U of T doing a lot of work, or in Toronto doing a lot of work with startups, the financial industries, the legal community, healthcare AI. Waterloo has Waterloo AI doing work. In Manitoba, we see a great deal of work happening in AI in Manitoba. They're having AI-enabled drones in Saskatchewan. Amy in Alberta, and even in BC, we have AI in BC really building a cluster. And up in Nunavut, they're talking about AI and how it can bring the community together and bring opportunity and empower the community. And we see the work that's happening from ISED, Innovation, Science, Economic Development Canada, and the work that they're doing for the superclusters. I'm quite proud to be involved with all 5 superclusters, and AI is happening across the board with those tool sets. We see AI being used for the watershed. We see it happening across communities. But what people might not know is that the Government of Canada is leading in areas of AI. The Government of Canada was one of the first to put out a directive for algorithmic impact assessment so that Canadians can have confidence that when AI is making a decision about their finances or about their benefits, that there's a proper review that's done. And that's led to the creation of the first national standard for the ethical design and use of AI from the Canadian CIO Strategy Council. All these things come together to provide a responsible use to AI so that we can have the confidence that it's doing what we want it to do. Now, all of this doesn't happen without communities. And, I'm quite pleased that my friend Vik Pant is here with me today to talk about the exciting work that he's leading at Natural Resources Canada and the communities he's built to really innovate with AI. So, Vik, I'd like to hand it over to you to share a little bit of a thoughts around, an intro to kind of some of the work that you're leading, and then we can have a broader discussion around, some of the impacts and some of the work that others can do to follow your lead.
Absolutely. Thank you, John. And thank you to FWD50 for having me. And always good to share the platform with you, John. The last time we did this, I was on the other side. I was asking questions. You were answering them. So I'm very delighted to have this opportunity to be on the other side of the table. Absolutely, John. You mentioned a number of very interesting things already. You talked about how important responsible AI, ethical AI are in the DNA of the Canadian government when we think about the use of AI. And I really think about this, and I hope to dive into this in our conversation, John, is really the how and the what. When you think about basically what do we mean when we say responsible AI, ethical AI, there's really two levels, John, to think about, right? One of them is that we're applying AI to use cases that are furthering the goals and values that we have as Canadians. So if you think about something like the just energy transition, when you think about climate change mitigation, adaptation, and remediation, so many use cases where artificial intelligence can lead to breakthrough results. So that's one element to what we mean when we say responsible AI in the government, certainly at Natural Resources Canada. But then the other what is really to make sure that we're doing things in a way that the artificial intelligence algorithms that are being used, the models that are being built, the predictions that are being generated, that they can be explained, that they actually are fair, that privacy is being protected. So really that's a meta view of if you think about responsible AI from a what perspective. The how perspective is interesting too, because a lot of times I have conversations with the industry colleagues, John, and folks always talk about the black box paradigm, and people talk about AI is not explainable and AI is opaque. And what's interesting is that there have been a number of breakthroughs in computer science, in information science, in data science that are leading to the hows to achieve the what's that I just described. So whether you think about techniques like using variational autoencoders to do dynamic upsampling for algorithmic fairness, fairness regularization, adversarial learning, whether you think about techniques for explainability, LIME, anchors. I know folks in the audience are the technical folks will be familiar with this. All the different techniques around privacy preservation. So all of that to say that, John, we set up a digital accelerator in the Natural Resources Canada department. And when we solve a problem, we solve it not just from a technical perspective to get to a prediction that meets a certain technical metric, but in fact, we do it in a way, we attempt to do it in a way that also helps us to ensure that these quality objectives that have been set from a reliability, responsibility, ethical AI perspective are also met, John. So lots to talk about, and I'm happy to have this opportunity to speak with you today.
So much to talk about in so little time, Vik. As you're going through, the neurons are just firing, and I remember our fast neuron conversations that we've had about this in the past. And so, just wonderful to have the opportunity to share these thoughts with our audience. I'd like to start with this idea of the use case. Right, all too often we see that people jump into digital technology, digital transformation conversations, and they almost call out Arnold Schwarzenegger with the T800 in these types of tools. Talk about some of those use cases that you're explaining and how they help us get crisp on, what are some of the considerations.
Absolutely, John. Happy to. And I remember you had an excellent presentation not too long ago where you had the picture of R2D2. Is that immediately, as soon as you say AI, people immediately jump to robots like R2D2. So it's interesting, John. Yes, and Arnold Schwarzenegger, absolutely. So a couple of things, right? So for us, John, you said it very well. I mean, it's all a question of priorities, and it's all a question of mapping what it is we're doing to what we should be doing. So when you think about it, from our perspective, we have a mandate letter that is received by our minister, and we use that as a way to set our departmental priorities. And if you think about the Natural Resources Canada department, we focus on energy, we focus on forestry, we focus on mining. And what's interesting is that in the mandate letter that we received there's a number of very important initiatives that can be benefited by the creative application of artificial intelligence. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So one of them has to do with building a network or a constellation of electric vehicle charging stations from coast to coast to coast. So now, where do you build these charging stations, right? You don't want to build them equidistant. That wouldn't make sense. So there's a lot of very interesting data sets that we have as the government access to, data sets that the government has, data sets that public sector, other public sector departments have, private sector companies, educational institutions. And so when you take all of that information, John, putting that into some very interesting geospatial types of modeling scenarios and time series modeling scenarios to estimate what would be the best places to put these charging stations, right? So before you get into sort of the recommender engine piece of it, that which algorithm should I be using? Should I be using some type of collaborative filtering or some other mechanism to filter through the list of candidate locations to identify the places where I need to put these charging stations? We have to first of all answer the question, why are we doing this in the first place? And so an example of that would be, for instance, the mandate letter priority that we have that I just described. Another example, John, has to do with flood mapping. So one of our mandate letter commitments is to elevate and to enhance Canada's capabilities when it comes to building flood maps. Flood maps, as you can imagine, can have very important critical response applications, public safety implications, but even long-range planning implications as to where to build communities, where to build roads, so on and so forth. So working closely with our partners at the Canadian Space Agency, our colleagues from the Canadian Centre of Mapping and Earth Observation, which is a part of NRCan, we trained some deep learning models to do extremely fast and extremely precise, high caliber satellite imagery analysis using techniques like image segmentation, semantic segmentation, things like that. And again, it's cool to use these types of new algorithms, new architectures, have these models that lead to very high technical performance results. But when you realize why you're doing this, it really makes it worth all the effort, all the extra hard work. So we can discuss a lot of different use cases, John, but you really asked a great question, because before we start getting into the algorithms, the technology part, where we're going to run this, what sort of cloud provisioning we need, John. I know you're an expert in all of this, but we really go back and say, what's our department's priorities? And John, sometimes, to be successful, it's good to know when not to do something. So in some cases where the benefits are not exceeding the cost, we leave it behind. We move to something else.
Absolutely. And that's perhaps something that we recognize in the private sector as well, where it's not part of our core mandate. How do we help out? And we might want to leave that behind. What I'm struck with is some of the alignment that your projects have with our AI for Earth or AI for Good projects, looking at things like water, looking at carbon sequestering and those types of projects. And so great synergies there, and really helping demystify or deflating some of those considerations around the use of AI. When you can make it real around, hey, we're going to help make people safer in the event of forest fires, or hey, we can help you pick where you're going to build your houses or your facilities, things like that. And I'm always amazed when we bring together the horsepower of NRCan, as well as the space agency, as well as those priorities that we have in Canada, those things that are near and dear to us, our natural resources. We are a powerhouse in that regard. Now, one of the things you mentioned was around those principles for responsible AI. Now, at Microsoft, we use the principles of fairness, of security, reliability, privacy, inclusiveness, accountability, and transparency. And you started to talk about explainability around some of those tools. How do you find you land those within your organization to have people build solutions that kind of address some of those considerations?
Great question, John. Thank you. And just for folks that haven't seen us talk before, John, I think the contest is still on for who can speak faster, who can get more words per minute in, because I know every time we talk, John, there's so much to say and so little time. So I'll try to slow down a little bit. But absolutely, John, I think, there's three things, and we've talked about this, you and I, before privately. I think three really important things that come into play. I mean, one is the technology, right? So very often, as I said in my intro remarks, that I talk to colleagues who are skeptical. And this goes back to the point that you made, John, that people in Canada, even though we make a significant, disproportionately large number of contributions in the field of explainability, privacy, fairness. Yet, as you mentioned, in a study of D8 countries, Canadians are generally the most skeptical of the of artificial intelligence, especially in those human-centric aspects. So really 3 things, John, I want to touch on briefly, and happy to dive in as you wish, as you say, double click as you wish. So one thing I would say, John, certainly has to be with the technology part. As I said before, yes, explainability, depending on what you mean by that, interpretability, transparency, is it real? Is it not real? Well, it's certainly not black or white. That I can say. I mean, there's a number of very interesting techniques out there, from metacognitive techniques to Lime plus anchors. We talked about a few technologies out there and techniques out there that do exist today, that perhaps you don't get global explainability. You can't explain how your model arrives at every possible output given any kind of input, but certainly with a constrained set of tested or a space of inputs to outputs mappings that you've traversed, you can make some local interpretations of predictions or of certain space of predictions. So the first thing to say is the technology piece is that, yes, have we solved the holy grail of having fully explainable models that are always explainable and every model is explainable? No. But the reality is that, if you can make some cost benefit trade-offs and you can say, well, I'm willing to trade off a bit of my F1 score here or my accuracy there, and I'm willing to get to a more explainable model, even if it's not a fully explainable model, but maybe it's prediction specific interpretations within a space of predictions. It's there, right? So the technology piece is there. It's not fully made, as I said, but researchers are focusing on it. Computer scientists, information scientists, data scientists, the same way that they're building new algorithms to do machine vision or reinforcement learning or recommender systems or time series analysis, they're also working, or natural language processing, they are also working to come up with new techniques to actually explain models, to interpret predictions. So the technology is the first piece of that, John, and we really keep up to date. In my team, we really scan the literature. We scan organizations like Microsoft and all the thought leadership coming out there to say what's state of the art. And it's changing so quickly, John. That's number one. Number two is literacy and culture. And you touched on this too. It's really a lot of times when you have these socio-technical complex issues, it's not about the technology, it's about the people. So being aware, knowing what's out there, knowing what the capabilities and the limits are of what is state of the art, what's on the horizon, even if it's not ready to be productionized or enterprise grade right at the moment. So what that means is, John, really making sure that our colleagues are spending the time going for trainings, spending the time interfacing with other thought leaders or industry experts who focus specifically on beneficial AI or responsible AI. Institutes like Vector Institute, very happy to say that our friend Ron Bodkin, who was hired to join them as the CIO and their VP of engineering, his background is in this, right? So working closely with colleagues that have that kind of knowledge base to bring that to the table and really elevating our collective intellect, if you will, our collective aptitude to talk about these topics in a reasonable way about beneficial AI, responsible AI. And then the third piece, John, you touched on communities. I think that's very important too, is I always like to say nobody knows everything and everybody knows something. And especially in a situation like this, where breakthroughs are happening on a daily basis, new innovations are coming out at a rapid pace, just being a part of communities, being a part of events like this, FWD 50, being a part of the Synthetic Intelligence Forum, where we do from time to time have conversations about privacy and fairness and explainability, John. So lots of interesting areas for us to double click on.
100%, Vik. I love those 3 areas of technology, of that literacy, and then as well of the communities. And one of the things that I've come to the realization and really been driven home with the work that I do on responsible AI as the team lead for the Microsoft Canada is that everybody has a role to play in helping shape and form where there are sensitive uses of AI. We were able to bring together multidisciplinary communities and have conversations around, well, what are the impacts? How do you feel about that? Bring together representation from the mosaic that is Canada. And what I'm finding is that everybody has a role to play in helping shape how we move forward with AI. And so I love this idea of literacy as well as community. Your community of the Synthetic AI Forum, did I get the forum right? Or
Close.
Really brings together thought leaders in these conversations. And maybe you can share, what you're trying to accomplish with the Synthetic AI community and some of the work that they're leading.
Yeah, absolutely, John. And it started about 4 years ago in the basement of the graduate room in the University of Toronto, John, which you know well, Spadina and Harvard. And it's really grown since then. And we used to do events just in Toronto. We launched a chapter in Ottawa, and now we're online. So it's really growing quite well. And the idea was always, John, like you said, it's not just about high level thinking, and it's not only about roll up your sleeves and let's start writing code. It's really about that middle, which is where those conversations can take place, which are not just sort of philosophical, because certainly that's important to have those meta level conversations about trade-offs and understanding what do we mean when we say responsible AI, beneficial AI, when is it sufficiently explainable, because a lot of these things aren't binary. So having those conversations, but then also diving into the code, but then also saying, okay, how do we go from the strategic to the operational through the tactical, John? So that's why we started that community. We have an event tomorrow, which is Thursday, online. Anybody can search on Bing and they can find the Synthetic Intelligence Forum and then just join online. We do have a colleague from Microsoft, Zia Mansour, and colleagues from StatScan and also from National Research Council. But the whole point was, John, professional networking among like-minded folks who wanted to really have a diverse set of viewpoints represented to talk about these topics, and also opportunities for knowledge sharing.
And it's a great venue for that, and I really appreciate the shout out for Bing, the other search engine, and so I really appreciate that. If we were to dive deep onto the second point that you made around this idea of skilling, one of the big challenges, we're being faced with so many different technologies, so many different business models, so many different business decisions. How do we lean in and help skill senior leaders within our organization to have them understand how AI can transform their business? You're in a science department, but how do you then embrace and engage your senior leaders for their decisions around to AI or not to AI?
That's a great question, John. That's a great question. And on this, I would like to plug, perhaps with your permission, the Canadian School of Public Service, who have an excellent curriculum, and they have something called the Digital Academy, where that's exactly what they're focusing on, John. And what they've done is something very interesting. And I have run a search on other public service schools in other countries, and really it's quite unique. And what it is, John, is we just touched on, they very nicely cognitively segmented out artificial intelligence into strategic, tactical, and operational. And if you think about it, the strategic is exactly what you mentioned. So colleagues who are not necessarily the folks that are building these AI models or maintaining them, but they're the ones who are signing off on proposals or signing off on prototypes or pilots or proofs of concept before putting them in production, senior leaders within department sector heads. So they do have a module that really focuses on that mapping piece we talked about, John, which is, there's a lot to talk about the how, but really let's get people up to the level when it comes to the what. So in our case, as I mentioned, we have mandate letter priorities, and everything in our department, not just AI, but all our initiatives are grounded in those, and certainly other priorities that come to our department, based on the various channels in government. The second piece is let's get to the third piece, which is the technical piece. They have plenty of really, really good training material. I think a lot of it is available on GitHub, so you don't even need to be a public sector colleague to actually get access to it. And everything from here's how you select algorithms, here's how you write code in Python, here's how you install something like Azure, this service, to get your machine learning containers in the cloud. So there's a very technical component, but that's not something that you would want a senior leader to have to deal with, and vice versa. It'll be great for a programmer or an analyst or a technologist to be aware of the strategic piece, but they'll probably be served a lot better by the actual operational kind of training that's available. And in the middle is really where I think it gets very interesting, is that bridge between those two paradigms, John. So I think the Canadian School of Public Sector has something good to offer. They have some really good value propositions. I like the content, and it's all about that mapping, John, using techniques like, for example, the balanced scorecard, but applied it into the context of AI, or the AI canvas from the Prediction Machines book. That's another very interesting tool, but really recognizing that there are 3 separate segments here, or n separate segments here. And if you focus on the right thing at the right level of colleague in the department, then without a lot of redundancy, without a lot of extra work, people can really take away the skills that they need to have to be successful in making decisions.
Absolutely, and I'd like to shout out for the School of Public Service. We've worked with them with their curriculum and seen the great work they do. And I think the main message here, it's so digestible, it's so approachable. Sometimes we look to AI and we hear about Bayesian decision trees, and our eyes glaze over and we want to go off to the next session. And really, I think to have approachable, digestible learning from the School of Public Service, or Microsoft's AI Business School, which is available online, or the Responsible AI materials, or the stuff on GitHub, it's all very approachable. And I think one of the things to really drive home for those business leaders is that, look, these tools now make AI democratized. They're easier than ever to use. And if you've ever used a wayfinding application on your phone to tell you the best route through traffic, you're using AI. An automatic translation, you're using AI. So it doesn't have to be this arcane and complex world to be able to review. I see there's a number of questions that have popped up in the channel, and so maybe we can start to look to these. The one comment, I'd love to hear about a case study related to conservation, if there is one. And so, Vik, I know that there was something you're doing on forestry management. Perhaps you can talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's one I can talk about, which is a project that is currently being worked on. So it's certainly not a concluded case study. We haven't finished the project, but the Natural Resources Department is working closely with the government of New Brunswick. We're also working with private sector partners. And essentially what we're doing is we're using artificial intelligence to build a, if you will, digital ecosystem, although that means something else in the software business, but truly a digital analog of a biological ecosystem where we're going to have a number at the end of the day. Each model, each machine learning model or deep learning model or reinforcement learning agent will be very, very narrow and specific to a specific task. But indeed, we're building an ensemble, or our plan is to build an ensemble where we put them all together. So over long time scales, we can estimate the growth of bioinventory. So for instance, now if you think about it, at the very atomic level, it could be a specific machine learning model that predicts tree ring growth for a certain kind of tree in a certain region over a certain period of time. And that's good by itself. I mean, it certainly has scientific value right there by itself. But if you think about that and you couple that with a few hundred other, or I don't know, tens of other, dozens of other similar models and agents that are interacting and bumping and shoving sort of in this virtual space, then you can actually have this digital twin, if you will, of a biological ecosystem. And that's a very interesting project that that brings together not just kind of the technological sophistication and advancement to build individual models, but then also to build these ensembles to really have something to do AI at a larger scale. And that, I think, is a very interesting project, and happy to report that, John, when we make further progress on that project.
Absolutely, Vik. I've had some insight into some of that work that's happening there, and really quite astounded by all the technologies that come together using LiDAR and satellite imagery and soil sensors and cloud computing and mixed reality. It all comes together to really gain reason over a bunch of data. For us in the Digital Technology Supercluster, we have a project that we call the Freshwater Data Commons, where we think about freshwater in Canada. We don't have a good view of how we manage this precious resource. And so with our partners, we're working on a solution that is putting 200 sensors on a body of water in the interior of BC, and it's checking for water temperatures, organisms, and everything within that watershed. And the intent is to be able to have a better day-over-day view of what's happening to our water systems, to be able to react and be able to respond more quickly and preserve this precious resource. And it's really great to see coming like this new view. Sorry, Vik.
No, absolutely, John. No, sorry to interrupt. And I was just going to say, in terms of this ensemble we're building, you can also think about another specific atomic example I can use, or a very precise example is basically estimating the invasion of, or the spread of invasive species, pestilences, right? So if you think about the spruce budworm, you think about the emerald ash borer, these are things that don't only have negative impact on the trees, but then they negatively impact the competitiveness, the productivity, the innovativeness of the Canadian economy. They certainly impact people's livelihoods who depend on them. They impact all of the folks who depend on downstream products and industries that they're related to them. So it's interesting that when you think about, one thing we always hear about deep learning and machine learning is that, they're great, they're very precise, they're very specific, but then they're narrow AI, as they always say, right, John? It's narrow, so they're very task specific. And that's great if you in certain cases, if that's the only thing which you're trying to solve for, and there's a lot of value there. But now that, for example, in NRCan, and this is another little plug here, is that our scientists had been working with machine learning in the forestry sector, in the geological service, since the mid 1990s, since the early 1990s. Certainly not deep learning, but they were still working with the precursors to deep learning, if you will, with shallow learning, right? So when you think about estimators to predict the spread, the growth of trees, and then you talk about how basically invasive species might permeate through some kind of an ecosystem. They're both separately important technologies that you can, or tools that you can use in a scientific endeavor, but you put them together, and you put them together with many other such similar kinds of tools out there, and now you can have some kind of macro level AI. So even though they're all narrow AI in the individual sense, but collectively you can have a more macro view of whatever system it is you're trying to simulate. But great question.
Absolutely, and you know what? One of the great things that we see all these projects doing is they're creating a ton of data that's being put out into the marketplace. And certainly, when we look at the superclusters, there's a big push to make sure that the ocean supercluster has a common data set, the protein supercluster has a common data set, manufacturing has a common data set. NRCan has long been known for putting data into the public repositories, into the open data repository, and we're quite pleased in our partnership with Stats Canada around the open government data side of the house. And so how do you see these partnerships working going forward? And what do we see about a governance model to support kind of the advanced use of these tools?
Absolutely, John. And you mentioned StatsCan, and again, another great department with just impeccable leadership and really doing great things. And I was watching, I think 2 weeks ago, when they launched the Data Science Network together with Microsoft and a number of other federal government departments. So that's exactly the kind of tools, kind of platforms, community enablers that we want, John. Because a lot of times, it's interesting, folks talk about community, but really it's done in an ad hoc or in an unsystematic or an unstructured manner. But to actually talk it and then have something that does bring not just government employees together, but multiple levels of government, FPTs together, brings together academic researchers, brings together private sector organizations together, so we can share data. We can do a lot of very, very cool data science experimentation, AI exploration together, John. I think so. Having the platforms such as the Data Science Network, I think, is very important. I think governance is a very, very important thing here, John. And I want to say maybe two things on this quickly. One of it is that because it's a community, and it has to be driven by sort of voluntary affiliation. It has to be driven by a willingness to participate, because that's really where knowledge sharing comes from. That's really where genuine transfer learning happens. So on the one side of governance, absolutely, and I'll talk about the sort of governance piece, but what I do want to say is it's important to keep these communities open as much as possible within reason, to ensure that that people are able to innovate, people are able to have interesting conversations and have creative collisions of ideas and take it to the next level. So not being too constrained in that community and allowing it to flourish from a bottom-up perspective, almost like a social media kind of an argument claim. But I do want to say, from a governance perspective, absolutely, John, there's a couple of things to consider here. First of all, as you mentioned, there is that directive on algorithmic decision-making, automated decision-making. There is the algorithmic impact assessment. You did mention the standard, which is very important. I think that needs to be the overarching rubric that is being advanced through such communities. And then most definitely the communities themselves need to be governed as well, using certain terms of reference, using certain protocols. And there, I really like how you touched in the very beginning, John, about the notion of inclusivity. You talked about the notion of equity. You talked about the notion of diversity and diversity of viewpoints and other forms of diversity. And I think that sometimes we want to, we don't want to get caught in a situation where AI becomes the self-selecting pool of people who are the self-anointed gurus, and only it's entry by invitation only. As the joke goes, right? I wouldn't want to be a part of a club that'll be willing to have me as a member, right? So same thing is, I think we want to be open, we want to be inviting, and that's why I started the Synthetic Intelligence Forum, was a warm, inclusive, safe space. When the event began, I know there was a mention made that there's certain term community codes of conduct. Same thing, John. So there needs to be governance, there has to be terms of reference, but it has to be such that it's not a controlling term of reference, it's an enabling and a supporting term of reference with, as you said, John, the most important values at the heart of such communities, which is inclusivity, diversity, openness, and just kind of warmth of inviting people to be a part of it.
Absolutely, and certainly we really enjoy that you've invited us to be part of that community, to have these conversations, because it's through these conversations that better decisions are made. We have better insight, and we're able then to really talk, I think, more smartly around some of the critical issues. When we use AI for health diagnosis, for example, that's a different environment than if we're using it for, let's say, changing the temperature in our homes and whatnot. So it's important to have the right context behind it and the proper conversations and the right people there to review these things. One of the questions that's come up specifically around this use of AI is, what are your thoughts on supporting technologies? Are there some supporting technologies that you think are critically important to advance our world of AI or our understanding of the world of AI?
Absolutely. This is such a great question, John. And we've talked about this before, John. And I remember this conversation we had where an oversimplification it is to say, and I know you'll probably laugh at this, John, you use IoT to capture the data, blockchain to store the data, and you use AI to crunch the data. And of course, now if you want to go all out, let's talk about quantum to actually do the computations that are not feasible with the traditional compute infrastructure. Then, of course, we talk about cybersecurity. We can run with this, John. But
That's right.
What I would say is certainly from an infrastructure perspective, in the current flavor of what we call AI. And, so some people also would, if I simply call the current version of AI all AI, then the folks who are quite favorable towards GoFi, the good old fashioned AI, which was the non-data centric AI, the kind of the symbolic systems AI, they might take offense to this. No, I'm just going a bit sideways. Data, absolutely, John. As we say in data science, models live downstream of data. So if you don't have data, you're not going to be able to do anything. So having the right kind of data hub or the data lake, and again, I don't want to get too caught up in sort of the jargon here, but the point is having good, clean, reliable data that you can trust. John, you talked about trust. You talked about reliability. You talked about robustness. That's number one. That's very important. I think number two is compute, because a lot of times when you're doing stuff in proof of concept or in pilots or prototypes, you don't fully understand, even myself in my team, sometimes when we're building prototypes and pilots and proof of concepts, we have the compute in-house. But then if we need to scale this over a 10 times bigger data set or a 20 times bigger data set, the compute requirement doesn't scale linearly. It may scale exponentially or hyperlinearly. So in that case too, you got to have really good compute there. And cloud, that's a big part of doing it. So you can get elastic scaling with your cloud infrastructure. And I do think that also this is one that a lot of times we don't talk about, is the UI, right? Because increasingly nowadays, AI is not something that's sort of predictions are being made in some back office or in some back end, and then people are kind of being impacted by them through 3 or 4 or 5 levels of intermediation. No, now you have situations where the person who is non-technical is directly engaging with a system that is powered predominantly by AI. So the UI needs to be such where that engagement really makes a lot of sense. So I'll say the data piece, I would say the compute piece, and I would say the UI piece. And John, you'll probably laugh and say, Vik, that's just the traditional N-tier, 3-tier architecture of the data, the application, and the presentation. But hey, I adapted it to the data science world.
Absolutely, and I really echo that need for thinking about the user interface, the user experience for AI. How do you present to a person, that there's a probability it's not 100% accurate or it's not 0% accurate. It's, hey, I'm pretty sure this is what I think it is, and then have them make that decision, and as well make that decision for the 10,000th time that they go through that particular algorithm. Think of a physician doing their machine diagnosis. Well, we've come to our time, Vik. It's been a whirlwind, as it always is. I always want to spend more time with you and with these fast neuron conversations. Really appreciate your insight and your thoughts. For the questions we're flowing through, and we didn't get to many of them, so we'll look to try to answer those later. So Vik, thank you again for taking the time and sharing your insight, sharing the great work that you're doing at NRCan. You're really a trailblazer. The work that you're doing around digital transformation there is outstanding, and your ability and willingness to share this with the community, I think, is outstanding. So I really appreciate that.
And John, if I may, as I sign out now, so definitely, I wanted to react to something you said earlier, which is you mentioned Bayesian decision trees and sort of the difficulty of crunching them. And I was going to say, John, you probably have no problem doing that. You probably are crunching partial differential equations and Navier-Stokes equations to do computational fluid dynamics in your head. So your neurons are back propagating and getting trained just right, John. So I don't think you have any problem crunching Bayesian probabilistic trees in your head.
Thanks so much, Vik. And thank you for our audience for participating. Really appreciate your questions and hope that you've gotten some nuggets of wisdom from this. And with that, I'd like to ask Dennis to run our closing video.
Innovation is not just a word, it's an action. With artificial intelligence, we are not crawling or walking or running. We are flying today. Microsoft AI helps an architect bring history back to life. He doesn't see data, he sees fragments of our past. This is now. Artificial intelligence helps farmers grow more food with less resources. She's not collecting information, she's feeding a growing population without wrecking the planet. This is real. An engineer explores how AI could help the deaf see sound. She's not looking at obstacles, she's staring down opportunity. Innovation doesn't see the possibility of tomorrow, it creates tomorrow. And are you ready for the headline? Tomorrow is here today.